Next, from the Union League Club in Chicago, former Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney interviews Representative Paul Ryan on his new book, The Way Forward. They also talk about their experiences running for president and vice president in 2012. This runs about 45 minutes.
I made a couple of good decisions in my life. One was who I married, and the other was who I chose to be my running mate. And there was no better person to be Vice President of the United States than Paul Ryan. And thank you. And if you're going to take a shot at me, you wouldn't be a bad president yourself. So we have an interesting, yeah. But we have some questions about a book that you have written this year, Paul. And I would note that I've read it, and I hope some of you have as well, so your questions can reflect that. But also, I know Paul pretty well, and as I read it, I recognized he actually wrote it. Most of the books you read that are written by politicians were not actually written by politicians. They were written for politicians by professional writers. But Paul wrote this book, I can tell, because it is his voice. It is written like he speaks, and that makes it even more touching and personal. But I want to begin by just asking, Paul, the American idea, the subtitle, or maybe the main title of the book, is The American Idea. What will you bring down for us? What does it mean to you, the American idea?
It's a way of life, and it's a way of life that has been brought to life by some critical ideas and principles that founded this country. In a nutshell, it's this idea that the condition of your birth does not determine the outcome of your life in this country. That no matter who you are or where you come from or how you got started, you can make it in this country. It's the land of opportunity. And it's a country that was built on an idea where our rights are ours naturally, and that our government is designed to protect those rights so that we can live in freedom and find opportunity and prosperity. No other system is quite like this one. No other country was created on an idea like this one. And the reason for writing the book, in a nutshell, is because a lot of people don't see it. They don't think it's there for them. They are worried that it's not going to be there for their kids or their grandkids. And so, if you don't like the direction the country's going, which we don't, or the policies that are in place, or the governing philosophy, which we think is crowding it out, displacing it, then as leaders, we should offer a different way forward. And that's why I decided to do that, because the whole point of this is the American idea and maintaining that legacy of each generation, securing it for the next generation, like our parents did for us.
And that is, without question, something we subscribe to. At the same time, there are a lot of people who'd say that American idea has not worked for them or for their life. There are a lot of people in this country who are poor, a lot of people who are in the middle class who are saying it's harder and harder to make ends meet, and they look around them and they watch TV and they see the rich and famous doing extraordinary things they can't afford, and they ask, why is it that some people are doing so much better and I'm not doing as well as I could? How do you deal with this growing income inequality, wealth inequality, and the issue of poverty? You spent some time really looking at poverty in a novel way, and your book describes that. But give us your thoughts on dealing with, if you will, the income gap, the wealth gap, and the extent of poverty in this country.
And this is something that I talk a great deal about in the book. My friend Bob Woodson is sitting here with us tonight because for the last couple of years, we've been touring around America, meeting with people who are triumphing over these difficult circumstances, who are fighting poverty, eye to eye, soul to soul, person to person, and doing it very successfully. And there's some incredible stories that I tell in this book about that. Now, to your bigger question, there are a couple ways of looking at this. You can look at the status quo, which is as you just described it, and a lot of people don't think that that opportunity is there for them. They're trapped in generational poverty, or they're in a situational poverty, or they're a middle-income person, running hard on the hamster wheel and just not getting ahead. And so what kind of an agenda and what kind of principles do you need to reignite this opportunity, this upward mobility, economic growth, a healthy economy? And I go through all of that, but at the end of the day, I would say, with respect to poverty in particular, we're at the 50th anniversary in the war on poverty. We spent trillions on this, just from the federal government, and we had the highest poverty rates in a generation. Deep poverty is the highest since we've been recording it. And I think you could easily argue that success in this war on poverty has been measured based on inputs. How much money are we spending? How many programs are we creating? Not on results, not on outcomes. How many people are actually getting out of poverty? How many people are finding that American dream? How many people are actually getting from where they are to where they want to be in life? And I think that requires a systematic review and overhaul of our approach to fighting poverty. And it means the government needs to be respectful of civil society, of our communities, of those who are actually doing a good job of fighting poverty. And the federal government needs to play a more significant role in mining the supply lines, not the front lines. In so many ways, the federal government displaces all those great things that are actually happening in our communities that can really bring people together, stop isolating people, and get them out of poverty. In so many ways, the inadvertent casualty in the war on poverty is it has told the common American taxpayer, this is government's job. Just pay your taxes, we'll take care of it. That's not true. It doesn't work like that. Everybody needs to get involved. People with faith, people without faith, with money, with time, with love, with whatever, and reintegrate and bring people back together in our society. And so there's a whole series of reforms that I've called for. And it's not, I'm not one of these people who thinks I have it all figured out. Believe me, this is a very humbling thing to do, to look into and research this. But I want to get this conversation started. Because if all we do is measure based on inputs and talk about status quo, then we will never actually have the kind of conversation, therefore, then the reforms to actually break this cycle of poverty, instead of manage it, actually solve it. And it also means a really strong, healthy, growing economy. And the policies in place today, based upon the philosophy of governing that is triumphing in government today, is holding people back. It's hurting economic growth. It looks at the economic pie of life as some fixed, static thing, and that it's the government's job to redistribute it, when our goal ought to be to grow the pie for everybody, remove the barriers so that people can blossom and flourish and really have a strong, growing economy. And so, I won't go through the whole book tonight, but basically what I try to do is articulate core principles and policies that flow from that to reignite this American idea, because I really do feel it's under duress. I feel like we're going in the wrong path, but the good news in this story, and I tell these stories of these amazing, heroic Americans from all parts of this country that have done incredible things, the seeds are there. The comeback is there. We can have this comeback in this country. We just have to get a few basic things right. And I have every bit of confidence we can turn things around and get ourselves and our country back on the right track.
Paul, for those that have read the book, you recognize that Paul contrasts two cities, Detroit and Janesville. I would have expected Detroit and Chicago to be a more natural comparison. I grew up in Detroit, and big Red Wings, a couple of Detroiters here, Red Wings fan. You're Blackhawks fans here?
Blackhawks, all right? Yeah, Blackhawks.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, big rivalry, great fun. Those were terrific times, and city. They were competitive in some respects. Detroit and Chicago, and I'm talking about in the 1950s and the 1960s, and yet Chicago. Look what it's become. Look at the city and the hub that it is of activity and industry and innovation and technology, and Detroit has suffered. And you describe in some detail what's happened to Detroit. And you contrast not Chicago and Detroit, but Janesville, where you grew up, which also went through some tough times and continues to go through some tough times. But you compare them. What happened to Detroit? Why has it gone through what it's gone through? And how does that contrast with Janesville or Chicago or other places in America that went through tough times but found a way out?
So it's a complicated story, and it's one that the comparisons aren't easy. But I think the story of Detroit is a cautionary tale for the country. Because if you go back and look and do a fiscal autopsy on Detroit and see the failures that have occurred, it's because of poor leadership and bad government. It's because of taxing and borrowing and spending and passing the buck on to the point where they actually went bankrupt, where they couldn't afford the police force, they couldn't afford the fire department, where the kids in the schools are getting the worst scores in the country. And so it's a cautionary tale of what I would call a philosophy of governing that if we play that out throughout our country or in our federal government, we'll have a similar ending. And the other side of the Detroit story is the comeback that we hope is coming. And the seeds that have been planting of the Cornerstone School, of what Dan Gilbert is doing there, of what Pulte Homes are doing there, of what citizens in civil society are taking matters into their own hands to regenerate their community and the reforms that are having. It's a tale of what America could become if we go the wrong direction, but also what Detroit can be if we apply the right ideas and principles. And growing up in Janesville, we live on the same block I grew up on. You know, as you know, I come from a big extended Irish Catholic family. My cousins John, Debbie, and Kelly Ryan are here.
There's always a Ryan in the room, wherever
Ryan,
you are.
Yeah. Yeah. Just so you know, I'm not. These are the only 3 Illinois Ryans I'm related to. That's kind of I wish I was related to Pat Ryan, but, you know, don't we all, right? Janesville was one of those communities where John and I grew up, that it's there for people when they fall down. The Rotarians, the Lions Club, the Optimists, the Catholic churches, the Lutherans, all the social groups in the civil society. You know, we had a pretty hard knock in our family, and my mom and my grandma and I went through some difficult challenges and times, but for Janesville, our community, and not just our friends and relatives, but people we didn't even know who came together and really helped make a difference, and then getting involved in that community and seeing what it does to support people. When we lost our General Motors plant, we only lived 2 hours outside the loop here. When we lost our General Motors plant, it was a huge punch to the stomach. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars of payroll into a town of $60,000. Excuse me, into a town of 60,000 people. A lot of my buddies from high school, a lot of the people John graduated with worked there, thought like their parents they'd have the same job, which made a good living, gone. And to see the kind of economic havoc that it wreaked on our town, but to see the city come together and pull people up, and we still have a ways to go, but to see the healing and to see the civil society and to see how people help each other, it gives me a perfect story of that middle space between ourselves and our government, which is where we live our lives, what we commonly call civil society, which is what Alexis de Tocqueville wrote so brilliantly about, which was this great, unique fabric of American life that we need to sustain and revitalize if we're going to get this country back on its track. And so people ask me why I believe what I believe and who I am. It's because of where I come from. It's because of my family. It's because of my community.
You call that social capital, as I recall. Right. What's the state of America's social capital in your view, and what does it take to, if you will, regenerate the kind of social capital that de Tocqueville thought was so unique about this country?
Well, that's where I do discuss the downside of liberal progressivism, which I believe is a principle of governing with no limit. And what it does is it seeks to fix every problem with a large centralized government solution, which ends up displacing and crowding out the civil society's social capital. I quote people who've been reading and tracking social capital for a long time. Bowling Alone is a fantastic book that Bob Putnam wrote, a Harvard economist who's written about social capital. The quick story is it's shrinking. Mm-hmm. We are not spending our lives together as much anymore. We're not engaged in our communities anymore. We're bowling alone. And this is something that has to be revitalized, and it has to be revitalized with economic growth. It has to be revitalized with bottom-up economic growth that provides jobs and growth and opportunity everywhere. But it also has to be revitalized with a new attitude toward our culture and our communities, where people have to understand that they themselves have to get involved. And then government has to respect its limits so that that can mature and occur. And that, to me, is how you revitalize social capital. Don't get in the way, encourage it, don't crowd it out, don't discourage it, don't overpower or overwhelm people, empower. And that, to me, is the critical secret sauce of American life, of the American idea, that has to be revitalized by each and every one of us in our communities, and the government has to respect its limits and focus on doing what it's supposed to do and do it well so that we can maximize economic growth and increase our social capital.
Now, let me turn to a topic that I know is not one that you spend a lot of time thinking about, and that is the national balance sheet and income statement. You know, a lot of people looked at Bull Simpson and the work that was done by this commission as they laid out a plan, and you were part of that effort. They laid out a plan to try and rein in the excess in Washington. And I don't know that anybody agreed with 100% of what came out of the commission, and you agreed with parts and not with others. But and of course it didn't deal with entitlements, which was an important part that should have, in my view, been part of that discussion. But nonetheless, it was, I think, in the view of a lot of people, a wonderful starting point for the president to say, look, this is a bipartisan commission. It has taken apart the federal budget. It's looked forward and forecast what's going to happen given demographic trends and financial trends in this country. And it laid out a pathway to get back to, if you will, stability, such that we don't have to worry about a future where we might not be able to count on Social Security and might not be able to count on Medicare and Medicaid, might not be able to count on a military that was second to none in the world. And yet the president didn't pick it up, didn't touch it. And I mean, you were there. What happened? Why did nothing come from that extraordinary effort, which got so much, you know, fanfare and enthusiasm as it was begun and as it was released, and then just nothing? What happened?
So, as we put it together, Alice Rivlin and I teamed up to have an amendment to Bowles-Simpson to do Medicare, Medicaid reform, because that's the biggest driver of our debt, the health care entitlements. And Alice Rivlin is a Democrat who was President Clinton's budget director, and we put this Rivlin-Ryan plan together as an amendment, which, had that occurred, I would have been very, you know, I would have thought this is a pretty complete package. It was rejected by the elected Democrats on the commission. I was also worried about the deep cuts in defense that was in it. So the way I looked at Bowles-Simpson was, there's a lot of good work here. I'm going to take the good work here, and then I'm going to add, basically, Rivlin-Ryan, what I would do differently on defense and taxes, and I'm going to introduce that and pass it through the House of Representatives, which I did in the next year, and I did it 4 years in a row. We've actually passed 4 years in a row a budget plan to balance the budget and pay down the debt.
Let me, before you go on, before you go on, I just want to underscore something that Paul just said. And that is that the House passes important legislation, that Republicans are not the party of no. The House has been passing legislation. Your roadmap has been passed, and it deals with entitlement reforms and getting our country on a stable fiscal footing, and yet it doesn't get picked up by the Senate, and is, of course, not picked up by the White House. So the idea that ours is the party of no is simply wrong. Ours is a party which is passing legislation, putting that legislation forward to the Senate. Harry Reid doesn't take it up. And if people want to actually see action in this country and dealing with problems from education to health care to immigration to our fiscal needs, tax reform, if people want to see those things happen, they're going to have to vote for Republican senators and ultimately a Republican president as well.
That's right. I'll finish the answer.
Yeah, please.
So I have enormous respect for Bowles and Simpson. They're great guys. And the thinking at the time was, here are the numerical benchmarks that you have to pass any budget plan to stabilize our fiscal situation. I didn't like some parts of what they did, and I thought it was missing a lot, so we put our own together and passed it and exceeded those benchmarks. We had assumed the president would do the same, that if he didn't like Bowles-Simpson, he would put his own plan out there, meeting these benchmarks to stabilize our fiscal situation, and he chose not to do that either. Bowles-Simpson was set up by his executive order, and so we really did expect him, once we decided not to support it, the House Republicans, and go do our thing, we thought that he would have triangulated like Bill Clinton did for the sake of 2012 and surrounded and supported. Instead, he jettisoned it, demagogued what we were doing, and did not offer a credible fiscal alternative that met anywhere close to the benchmarks of Bowles-Simpson. And meanwhile, we still have this same fiscal problem looming over us. Why is that? Look, you'll have to ask him, but my personal theory is ideology. And I write about this in the book at the particular moment where it was clear that what decision was being made, and I just think it was more of an ideological interest that was in front and center of his mind versus something that was more moderate or moderate seeming. And I just believe at that moment when he decided not to do Bull Simpson, to demagogue Republicans, and not to offer a credible alternative, that was just really what this administration was about. So that's when I concluded we're going to need a new president to fix this mess.
You might describe, I agree. You might describe how it was unveiled to you, your experience.
Yeah. Well, I had a front row seat to it.
I think it's a personal story, which is interesting, and you had to make a decision about whether or not to remain.
Yeah, so the three House Republicans were myself, Jeb Henschling, and Dave Camp, Chairman of Ways and Means, Chairman of Financial Services, myself, the budget guy, who were on Bull Simpson. And the White House invited us to a budget speech that the president was going to give. And all the media was coming up to us a day or two beforehand thinking, I hear he's going to do Social Security reform. I hear he's going to do the olive branch to you guys. I hear he's going to, do something to reach out to you guys. So we were sort of conditioned into thinking, oh, he went pretty far left on all these other issues, but maybe on the fiscal issues, he's going to move to the middle and triangulate. And we thought for sure when we got there, we saw Bowles and Simpson and everybody else from the commission that he was going to embrace Bowles Simpson. And we kind of figured that was going to happen. We had that front seat, and he was sitting between closer to that beam, that column, and myself, 20 feet away, giving a speech, basically calling for another round of $400 billion in defense cuts on top of what they had already done, which was a budget-driven strategy, not a strategy-driven budget for defense, which thought was rather odd. But then he just pursued to just absolutely demagogue the work that we had been doing, nothing about Bull Simpson, and it became very clear to me that the demagoguery that was coming out of his speech was aimed at just doubling down and going hard left, hit defense, raise taxes, go after Republicans. And that's when I realized this is not a compromiser. This is not somebody who's going to move to the middle. And we got a text from one of our colleagues watching it in his office on TV saying, you guys should get up and leave right now. We looked at it and we discussed it and we decided out of respect for the office of the presidency that we wouldn't do that. Even though it was really over the pale. And so we got up and promptly left afterwards. And then did a press conference.
Good. I see we're almost out of time with me asking questions. Let me ask one more here and then let you ask one or two if you'd like. And that is, I happen to think the president hasn't been successful. That is apparently the understatement of the evening, and I'll put aside foreign policy for a moment, where his failures have been most glaring recently, but domestically, there was an article just this week in the Wall Street Journal by Phil Gramm, former United States senator, as you know, who calculated what America would be like if the recovery were like the other post-war recoveries. And he calculates that there'd be approximately 14 million more Americans working, and the per capita income in this country would be $6,000 higher. A pretty dramatic difference between the president's record and that which he campaigned on. The president said he'd bring America together. We'd be unified. We'd be at a post-partisan presidency with reaching out across the aisle and so forth. And these things have not succeeded. Again. And I wonder why. From your perspective, I have my own views, of course, but from your perspective, why has the president failed to unite us, failed to work across the aisle, failed to get this economy going on the kind of time frame? It's going to come back. The private sector will fight its way through almost anything and find a way. That's what our innovators and people do. But it's taken a long time. And I wonder, from your perspective, why has it been so unsuccessful? Why has it taken so long for people to get jobs, for people to get higher incomes, and for there to be the kind of unity that the president campaigned on?
Yeah, so that calculation was that this is the worst post-war recovery we've had, and that if it were just at the average of the prior 10 recoveries from recession since World War II, it would have had those metrics. There's one point that I think is very important to make, and I try to make this in the book. It's not just this president, as if we get another person, whoever it is, it's all going to be better. It's the philosophy of governing, and it's the policies pursued by this administration. So, but for government, I believe we would have had those kinds of recoveries. And so if you take a look at just the enormous amount of uncertainty that is plaguing businesses with the hyper-regulatory state that's occurring. You know, one of our great cheeses up in Wisconsin has been canceled for production this year because of fear of these new FDA regulations. And that hits us pretty personally at home in Wisconsin. You know,
You cheeseheads are very concerned,
yeah. Tax uncertainty, higher taxes. The Federal Reserve is out there, you know, priming the pump, which is savage savers in this country. It is, and the money's not getting to small businesses. Credit is slow for small businesses. Dodd-Frank makes big banks bigger and small banks fewer. You have Obamacare that is putting an incredible amount of uncertainty with that looming employer mandate hanging out there, so people aren't getting hired there. Even CBO tells us the equivalent of 2.5 million people won't work because of the disincentives to work of Obamacare. So you have taxes, you have regulations, you have the fact that the debt is $17 trillion and growing and no reduction in sight coming. And I think you have a political modus operandi which doesn't seek to bridge differences but seeks to sort of basically polarize and intimidate and divide people based upon what divides them and prey on the emotions of fear, envy, and anxiety versus an aspirational political system that speaks to people with ideas, that unifies people based on aspirations, based on hope, based on opportunity. Ronald Reagan did it very well in 1980. This can be done again. But I do believe it's the philosophy of governing that's employed. In a third Obama term, which would be Clinton or Warren or whoever would keep these things going. And it's this philosophy and the policies that flow from it which basically believes that we need to delegate our power, our money and our power and our decision-making to unelected bureaucracies to run our lives effectively, to micromanage society, to micromanage the economy. It doesn't work. The whole idea of this country is self-government under the rule of law. And we're not seeing self-government, and we're not seeing an equal application of the rule of law, and the private sector is shrinking as a result of it, or isn't meeting its potential as a result of it.
I'll turn to you.
You and I have had fantastic questions over the last few years on a lot of issues. But one issue that we didn't discuss here that we have discussed quite a bit is foreign policy. We see things very similarly in the world for our defense program and just the state of things now. So I have two questions I want to ask you. First, give us an assessment of not just the Obama foreign policy, but of America's foreign policy. Tell us what you think, where we are, and what we ought to be doing differently.
Big topics, and I know you have questions from the audience, so I'm not going to take much time on this. But we've had a foreign policy as a nation, frankly, since Truman, who after the Second World War said, look, we've gotten dragged into awful things as a world and as a nation. And for that to not happen in the future again and again and again, we have to adopt a series of policies. And Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, wrote a book called Present at the Creation of a foreign policy, which has been the basis of America's foreign policy ever since. And that book basically says a few things that were fundamental. One is that we would be involved in the world. That doesn't just mean with guns, that means with diplomacy, with our economy. We would promote our values and our ideals. That's the second point, that American principles of freedom and free enterprise, that these things would be promoted around the world. And that the combination of being involved in the world, promoting our values, and then linking our arms with our allies, being strong, and having a strong military. Those three things, being involved, promoting our values, and being strong, and doing so with our allies, that's been the foundation of our foreign policy. The president campaigned and has adopted a very different foreign policy. Hillary Clinton said something interesting the other day, as you know, which she was very critical of the president's foreign policy and basically said he doesn't have one. And I used to say that during the campaign, but the truth is he does have a foreign policy, and it's very different than that Truman and every president since Truman has followed. And his foreign policy is one based on the view that everybody has the same interests and all wants the same things. And I don't believe that. I believe some people want to dominate and oppress other people and want to take over other nations. I believe there are some people that are fundamentally evil, and we've seen some of them on TV this week. So one, that premise was wrong in my view. Number two, he looked at Vladimir Putin and others and said, oh, let's have a reset. By the way, Hillary Clinton tries to distance herself from the foreign policy of the president. That would work better were she not his Secretary of State for 4 years. And she was the one with a picture with herself and the Russian foreign minister with a big red button reset. I mean, what big smile. I mean, can you imagine such a thing? Did they not understand that people have very different objectives? Vladimir Putin's objective may well be, as George Shultz said the other day, to rebuild the Russian Empire. Those mistakes, combined with some other tactical mistakes, in Syria, for instance, to draw a red line and then say, gosh, I guess I can't react without getting Congress's approval. Oh, but right now he's willing to act in Iraq without Congress's approval, but nonetheless couldn't do it then, and then steps back from the red line altogether. That sent a message to Russia and to others in the world that's been extraordinarily unfortunate for America. And so we've seen an explosion of very bad things throughout the world because the rest of the world has calculated what's happening. One more element of our foreign policy, and that is a dramatic reduction in our military capability.
That's right.
And there's the quadrennial review that was recently completed and then reported on by a commission, including President Clinton's Department of Defense Secretary. Just take a gander at that and see what's happening to our Navy and our Air Force and our Army and what's happening to our nuclear capability. And that said to these other nations, guess what? Hey, America's not here and we're down there. America's going to be going there. We can compete. We can build. China is building and investing enormously in the military, including a deep-water Navy. Russia is investing in their military capabilities. And there are other nations as well that are expanding their military might and ambitions. I happen to think that the president's policies, this going out with a personal charm offensive, and believing that people all want the same thing, we can all get along. And by the way, that maybe a multipolar world militarily is the way to go. It's like, well, who else besides us? If it's a multipolar military world, are the others Russia and China? Is that what we want to see? I mean, I believe in having an American economy, an American diplomacy, an American military so strong that no one in the world would ever think of testing us. And that... So as a good Republican, I'm proud to say I'd like to return to the principles of Harry Truman. Yeah. I'd like to once again say that we will be involved in the world. It's important to be involved in the world, to keep bad things from happening. We had intelligence telling us that ISIS was being formed, that it might come into Iraq and attack a city there. What did we do? What did the president do? Watched. And as it spread across Iraq, now it's very difficult to pull it out. It's important to pull it out. This kind of group having a base throughout the Levant would be a terrible conclusion for the world and for us. So I return to the idea of being involved in the world and not pulling back and saying, oh, we hope bad things won't happen to us. That's like, paying the cannibal to eat you last, as Churchill said. Yeah. I mean, we have to be involved and help shape things. We're the leader of the free world. And then number two, we're going to be involved in the world. We're going to promote our values, free enterprise, human rights, human dignity. And then finally, we are going to be strong. We're going to have a military that's strong. We're going to link arms with our allies. We're going to stand with Israel. We're not going to waffle about who's our friend and who's not. That's right. I think you have to see that for America's security, for our safety, for our confidence that our children will live in freedom and have prosperity. We have to have that as our foreign policy. Foreign policy and domestic policy are inexorably linked. You can't have a strong, one effective without, they have to work together. And I think the president's been effective in both areas, as you might imagine. I wasn't expecting that I would love his second term, but I've been even more disappointed than I'd expected. And I'm hopeful that we'll be successful in electing more good colleagues like you, Paul, that more people will read your book, and that we'll end up being able to pass some legislation and get it to the president's desk and ultimately take a new direction. America needs real leadership. It's very much missing.
And our obvious goal is to build a coalition that can win a majority of the country to do just that. I have one last question before we go to the audience. It's an important one, pretty easy to answer from my perspective. If you had to decide, would you choose and select Julius Peppers or Jared Allen?
Oh, that's easy. Julius Peppers, of course. Yeah.
Tough crowd here.
What is the status of immigration reform in the House? Is there the possibility for a compromise between the House and the Senate?
I don't think there is right now. I think part of the problem is the administration has decided to go outside the purview of the law in so many different areas. You currently have a crisis on the border. 3 weeks ago, the House passed legislation to deal with that. Legislation to deal with the trafficking law that needed to be amended. Legislation to deal with problems on securing the border. We have heard nothing from the Senate yet. So while we have a border crisis right now, a humanitarian crisis that needs to be attended to, that's really first thing first. If the president goes it alone again with his phone and pen routine and tries to unilaterally write laws by changing immigration laws, which is beyond the purview of the executive branch's power, that's the legislative branch's power to write laws, but if he does do that, I think he'll poison the well and make it far, far more difficult for us to come together. As a fan of immigration reform, as a person who writes about it specifically on what I think we ought to do in the book, as a person who's been supportive of immigration reform, I hope he doesn't go it alone, and I hope that he sticks within the confines of the law, confidence building, fix the border crisis right now, and then maybe we can start talking, but that's not, we're a long ways from that right now.
Thank you. The next question is, so now what do we do on health care?
Well, how much time do you have? I'll be brief. We want a system where everybody can have access to affordable health care, including every person with pre-existing conditions, and we can have that system without a costly government takeover. We can have that system which is a patient-centered system, where we, each of us as patients, are the nucleus of that system. And all the healthcare providers out there, the doctors, the hospitals, the nursing homes, the insurance companies are competing against each other for our business. It's called a market-based system. The reason I can see you so well is I had LASIK surgery 14 years ago. It was elective, and now that surgery is half as much as it cost 14 years ago and 3 times as good. So it's not as if these great principles of choice and competition, of quality, are immune to the healthcare system. It's that they haven't been fully applied to the healthcare system. And so I put in the book in great detail what kind of a patient-centered system we ought to go to, and this is for all of these programs, Medicare, Medicaid. We need an individual-based, patient-centered, market-based system where we each collaborate and serve each other, and the providers have an incentive to innovate, to create. That's the kind of system we need to replace Obamacare, which will collapse under its own weight, in my opinion.
Thank you. I'm sorry you can see me more clearly. I apologize. How did the two of you manage to maintain your sanity with all the terrible things that were being said about you during the campaign?
Mitt, you want to go first?
More terrible things were said about me than him. I actually got some good advice when I was running for governor in Massachusetts. The political strategist that I hired said he had a couple of rules. One of them was this, that I was not allowed to read the paper as it related to my campaign. I, of course, could read about other things, but no articles about the campaign at all. And he said, you can watch TV. He said, because we'll win on TV. He said, and I said, well, I want to read these articles. He said, no. He says, because you're going to have some 22-year-old person who doesn't like you write some article, and you'll find yourself subconsciously referencing it or refuting it in your comments all day long, and you're going to be off message. So I don't want you to read these articles. It was great advice. I did not see all the awful stuff that was said about me, all right? In the presidential campaign, we were working. Paul and I were, I mean, it was early in the morning, event after event after event, and late at night. And a lot of fundraising, a lot of rallies. It's exhilarating. I should tell you, I mean, you might think at the end of the day, you must just fall into bed. You can't go to sleep at the end of the day.
That's right.
You have so much energy. I mean, we'll have a crowd of 20,000 people cheering and cheering, and it's like, boy, this is important. It's great. And at the end of the day, you know, thank heavens for the Gideons in the Bibles. I could read that for a while, and I was ready to go to sleep. and it's a marvelous experience, particularly if you don't spend a lot of time worrying about the attacks that come your way. I think it's harder on your family,
yeah.
but frankly, you're in it because you care about this country, desperately care about America. And if you're worried about what people say, why you shouldn't get in the race.
Yeah,
Paul?
Same thing. You have to have thick skin, but don't have impermeable skin. Don't let it change who you are. Stay the same person you are. Just don't let it get to you. And if you believe in what you're doing, just go do it and don't worry about the rest. That's the way I look at it.
How about your families? How did they handle it?
They adjust to it. Well, our kids were pretty young, and so and everyone treated them well. The media treated them well. The Obama campaign, you know, they were off limits, and that was respected. And my wife, you know, she doesn't like the criticism I get, but she also learned how to grow thick skin as well in these things. And both of our wives, you know, they're strong women. They're very smart, intelligent, strong women who understood the stakes for the country, and so they were able to see it through as well.
This is interesting. Do you think that a four-year college is necessary to get out of poverty, and is the debt worth the payoff?
No, and it depends. It's not worth necessary. Job training reform, skills training is essential. I go through a great detail on how that ought to happen to bridge this skills gap. We don't have to emphasize it as much as we have. We have to make it cool again that it's okay to get a welding degree, that it's okay to go to 2 years and get some high-value skills that can give you a good livelihood. And on college tuition inflation, if we just keep feeding the beast with more and more federal spending, in one pocket, out the other, you will just feed tuition inflation. We need to flatten this. We need to go at the root cause of tuition inflation. I would say accreditation reform is necessary so that we have real competition against the Brick and Ivies. We all went to one of those. But let's look at the fact that we're in a new, innovative society, and let's have more competition so that a person who may be, you know, not able to go to a college, but can do it online, and they can get their math course from MIT, their theology from Notre Dame, their engineering from University of Wisconsin, allow them to bundle and put them together, allow these kinds of new innovative things to happen, and take down the barriers to entry that are already erected against these innovative ideas that are out there to allow people to excel at education, and to flatten the costs. We need more competition. We need less barriers. And that, to me, is one of the ways we get at the root cause of college tuition, along with transparency, just like health care. Does this degree get me where I want to go? What is the success rate? Just like health care. Give me the data on quality, on outcome, so that I know before going in what I can expect. And I want these people, these healthcare workers and these educators, competing against each other for my business based on outcomes, value. Do I get a good job? Do I get a good salary? Am I educated in this? Make them compete, and right now they're not.
Okay, last question. Do you think that the children in Illinois, and I would expand that to mean most states where this applies, who are raised by gay and lesbian parents are better protected and more likely to lead happier lives now that the Sexual Marriage Act is legal in Illinois?
Well, I don't know the Illinois Act, but if there's a child that is an orphan, that is adopted, that finds a home of loving parents, then that's a child that is no longer an orphan, that is no longer homeless.
Great. Okay.
You're watching the Illinois Channel.